Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to our viewers in different parts of the world. And a special warm welcome to you from today's broadcast, webcast from the World Council of Churches. My name is Deacon Adebayo Anthony from the Church of the Lord Worldwide, Nigeria. And I am a member of the Commission of the Churches on International Affairs. Over the years, I have worked very closely with multilateral organizations, international ecumenical organizations, including the World Council of Churches, in advancing nuclear disarmament issues all around the world. On the 23 and 24 October 2020, Jamaica, Nauru, and Honduras ratified a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. While we have welcomed every ratification, these three were particularly significant because they brought the total number of ratification up to 50. Following the 58th ratification on Saturday, 24 October, the 90-day countdown started, after which the treaty entered into force and became a legally binding enforceable instrument. Today, in West Africa, 9 states has also signed. And only recently, we, together with partners within the ECOWAS region, we are able to galvanize and rally around the Republic of Togo in ensuring its timely ratification of the TPNW. In our today's webcast, we'll be hearing from 4 speakers who have advocated in different ways and from different contexts for the elimination of nuclear weapons. First, we will hear from Reverend James Bragwan from Fiji. He is the General Secretary of the Pacific Conference of Churches and a Methodist minister. He is an ecological stewardship and human rights activist on a range of subjects which affects the Pacific region, including the climate emergency, gender-based violence, nuclear disarmament, self-determination. He is married with 2 children and a keen stand-up paddle brother. So, Reverend James, let me start by asking you to please describe how the Pacific region was affected by nuclear testing and what are the lingering impacts.
Thank you, Adebayo. Well, for the Pacific, the specter of nuclear weapons has really been a shadow on our region since the first atom bombs were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki during the Pacific War, or the Pacific Campaign, World War II. And since then, the people and the environment of the Pacific have suffered as guinea pigs, pretty much, for the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And these experiments, designed to secure world domination, were undertaken by the United States, which had 109 tests in the Marshall Islands, in Kiribati, Johnson Atoll, Alaska, and in the open Pacific Ocean. The United Kingdom, or Great Britain, had 21 tests in Australia and Kiribati, and France, which had 340 tests in Maui, or French Polynesia. Now, to put an impact on this test in scale, the uranium-fueled atom bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima had a blast which was equal to 12 to 15,000 tons of TNT. And that destroyed 5 square miles of the city. In the 50 years that followed the end of World War II, from 1946 to 1996, by the US, the UK, and France, that number of tests is the equivalent to 9,010 Hiroshima bombs, or between 108 to 135 tons, or 1,000 tons, or kilotons of TNT. And that's our reality. The forced experimentation on our Pacific Islanders, the destruction of island atolls, pollution of the ocean. And so in the context of nuclear weapons, although since the Second World War, they have not been fired in war. The peacetime use of nuclear weapons or the testing of nuclear weapons has had a tremendous negative effect on our Pacific Island communities and the ocean and land itself.
Thank you, Reverend James, for your response. Let me also go ahead by asking you, during 2020, tragic event in the US focused the spotlight on the issue of racism in an unprecedented manner for recent years. Can you tell us how racism has always been at the heart of decisions about nuclear testing?
The issue of racism and nuclear testing is really a crux of the matter kind of question or issue. Because racism and colonialism go hand in hand. The Pacific Islanders, in whose islands, in whose ocean these nuclear bombs were exploded, far away and a very, very safe distance from these colonial powers of the USA, Great Britain, and France, were done without any consultation, without any information. In fact, most of the indigenous people who were in these areas were lied to. And when we have the impact on the environment and the subsequent impact in terms of radiation poisoning and the illnesses that have then come into our Pacific Island communities in the forms of cancer, in the form of deformed embryos and children and tumors. Very little attention has been given. And so our Pacific people, particularly in Mauhinui, French Polynesia, in the Marshall Islands, in Kirisimas Island in Kiribati, even the servicemen who were forced to be participants or witnesses to these things, their cries for justice and reparation have continued to go unheard and undealt with. And so these tests are an example that in the 20th century, there was still this attitude of, terra nullius, that this land or these oceans are empty and the people who live here really don't count. So for me, that really comes to the heart of the issue of racism and the value of human life, of people that are are not from these colonial or these larger countries. And particularly because we are Pacific Islanders, we are seen as less evolved or less civilized, perhaps, because our understanding of community and development is different from everyone else. I think that is the real challenge, that our cries for justice still are not being heard.
Finally, Reverend James, how has the Pacific Conference of Churches used theology to encourage Pacific Island states to ratify the TPNW?
Oceania, or the Pacific, is a largely Christian community. 90% of Pacific Islanders identify with the Christian faith. 80% of the Pacific population belong to congregations that are members of the Pacific Conference of Churches. And so in terms of theology, it's been very simple. We've talked about justice. We've talked about righteousness. We've talked about the cries for justice that the prophets cried out, the cries for justice for widows, by widows and orphans, by the marginalized, the justice that is part of the kingdom of God, which we are all supposed to be manifesting in our lives and as Pacific people. And beyond human beings, and this is an important part of our Pacific culture, that we recognize our deep connection to the land and to the sea, and recognizing that we are a part of creation. We are not separate from creation. And so engaging in that, believing that God created the world in which we live as a means to sustain humankind and to provide life through water, food, and shelter. And that protection of our Pacific, of this part of God's creation, is our responsibility as guardians of creation. And we're in a situation now where the Mururoa Atoll has serious cracks in it as a result of these hundreds of nuclear tests over this period in French Polynesia, Maui Nui, where the Runit Island Atoll or Enewatak Dome, where radioactive waste is being stored, is leaking into the sea, and recognizing that these nuclear weapons are of no good for anyone. And we who have experienced the repression and the oppression by colonial countries and being guinea pigs, need to tell our story and need to stand up for what is right. And so we've been very grateful to see the response of those Pacific Island countries that have ratified the nuclear weapons ban treaty. And, we celebrate with all of those that have joined in this fight, particularly with PCC from the 1970s as part of the nuclear free and independent Pacific movement. We celebrate the ratification, and we really look forward to this becoming international law very soon.
Thank you, Reverend James, for this very deep insight. It is shocking to hear that nuclear testing carried out over Maui Nui, French Polynesia, amounted to the equivalent of over 9,000 Hiroshima explosions, with no regard for long-term impact on the land, water, and all living beings of God's creation in that region. Our next speaker will tell us more about the role of Christians as guardians of creation and our role to speak out against injustices which nuclear weapon represents. Archbishop Stephen Cottrell is the 98th Archbishop of York and has previously served as the Bishop of Chelmsford and the Bishop of Reading. He is a member of the Church of England's Committee for Minority Ethnic Concern, the chair of the Church Army, and Anglican Society for Evangelism and Social Outreach. He is a member of the House of Lords, as well as known writer and speaker. He is married to Rebecca, who is a potter, and they have 3 sons and 1 grandson. So may I ask you, Archbishop, what guidance does the Bible give us about weapons of mass destruction and the role of Christians to advocate for their elimination?
I think from a Christian point of view, issues of war and the possession of weapons of war is a contested area. Many Christians are pacifists, but probably a greater number of Christians do hold the position that there are certain circumstances when, as a last resort, it can be appropriate to use force and to bear arms. I think what unites Christians is an ethical approach to the use of force, which is usually spoken about as the just war theory, which really says that we should only use force as a last resort in ways that are proportionate and when there is a reasonable, a high expectation that you'll actually achieve the ends that you want, which obviously is the cause of peace and stability. But to protect the innocent, there may be occasions where this is appropriate. Therefore, weapons of mass destruction, which can never be proportionate, can never be used. And if they can never be used, then it follows that they shouldn't be possessed. So from a Christian just war position, as well as a Christian pacifist position, weapons of mass destruction, such as nuclear weapons, should be things that the world gets rid of. And actually, in other cases, we have seen this happen. Chemical weapons, there are international bans on chemical weapons. There are even international bans on things like landmines and cluster bombs. We have, as an international community, found ways of agreeing that certain weapons should not be used and therefore should not be possessed. We need to arrive at the same point with nuclear weapons.
Thank you, Archbishop Stephen. Let me also ask, in the UK, for instance, there is still a strong public belief in the doctrine of nuclear deterrence. What can the church do to challenge public attitudes in this respect?
Yes, it's hard to know exactly what public opinion is about nuclear weapons in general and the renewal of Trident in particular. When it was last discussed in Britain, there does seem to be a small but sizable majority of public opinion in favour of retaining the so-called nuclear deterrent. But I think what the church can do is actually challenge the very idea that a nuclear weapon is a deterrent. I think that's where we need to focus our attention. Something which has the most terrible capacity to destroy life and to destroy the possibility of life cannot ever be used, therefore cannot ever really be a deterrent. For it to be a deterrent, you have to be prepared to use it. Which is something that could never be done with a nuclear weapon. And there are no circumstances where a nuclear weapon could be used reasonably or proportionately. So I think the part the church has to play is on putting forward the moral and ethical case against the use and possession of nuclear arms, and thereby, I hope and pray, winning the argument. Alongside that, there are all sorts of other good reasons why nuclear weapons are not a good idea. For me, as a Christian, the primary reasons are the moral reasons. But it also happens to be the case that even people in the military now question the appropriateness of nuclear weapons in today's world and for the demands of peacekeeping by the armed forces in today's world. There are also very good pragmatic reasons why there's a lot of things one could spend all that money on, which would be a lot better than a nuclear weapon. So I think the church can be involved primarily at in terms of the moral arguments, but can also put forward the military, the fiscal, the legal arguments, which help, I believe, in time, change the mood in our nation, of which, of course, the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons is such an important part.
Finally, Archbishop, how will you continue to encourage your government to join the TPNW and get rid of all its nuclear weapons? What can the WCC do to support your efforts?
I hope, first of all, that Christians can join together. This is something which should be at the forefront of the Christian agenda for peacemaking and peacekeeping in the world, to put forward the strong moral arguments for not retaining a British nuclear deterrent, so-called. These are weapons of mass destruction. These weapons have a horrifying ability not just to kill people, but to make life on Earth itself impossible. So we need to work together to help people understand that just because there hasn't been a use of nuclear weapons for 75 years, the possession of them and the terrible risk of others possessing them is such a great danger to the world. And then within the Church of England, where I serve, I and some of my colleagues will continue to use the opportunities we have both to shape and influence public opinion, but also to help politicians see not just the moral arguments, but also the military, the fiscal, and the legal arguments that combined should help us to see that nuclear weapons no longer have a place in our world.
Thank you, Archbishop Stephen, for clearly articulating why even Christians who support the use of force in some situations should join the call for total elimination of nuclear weapons, as well as the legal, ethical, and moral considerations. You have also mentioned the pragmatic and economic reasons for the continuation of nuclear weapon programs. And in 2020, the world has seen as never before the urgency of pulling critical resources together to prioritize the spending on health and livelihood of our nation's citizens. Our next speaker is Alicia Sanders-Zink. Alicia is the Policy and Research Coordinator at the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. She directs and coordinates research on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, and general nuclear weapons policy. Previously, she was a researcher at the Arms Control Association at the Brookings Institutions and has published over 100 news articles, editorials, and reports on nuclear weapons. Alicia, can you please tell us how attitudes towards nuclear weapons have changed since 2017? And how has ICANN been able to demonstrate the inherent racism at the heart of attitudes towards these weapons?
Thank you so much for having me here and for such a great question. In 2017, we filled the legal gap on nuclear weapons by enacting the first international prohibition on nuclear weapons. And now on January 22nd, this prohibition will take full legal effect by entering into force. So what does that mean? We've seen, since nuclear weapons have been prohibited, the growing stigmatization of these weapons. We've seen this, one example is with the shift in the Catholic Church, where we saw Pope Francis take a stand on considering nuclear weapons possession itself to be immoral, and not only the use of nuclear weapons. And we saw the leadership that the Holy See played in negotiating and advocating for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So we're seeing nuclear weapons be really recognized for what they are, weapons of mass destruction that have indiscriminate, horrific humanitarian consequences. And of course, nowhere is that more true than in Indigenous communities and communities of color. We've seen that nuclear weapons have unjustly and disproportionately impacted these communities through decades of nuclear weapons testing near these communities and colonized land. And we thank courageous testimony and relentless of impacted communities, from the Hibakusha in Japan to the survivors of nuclear weapons testing in the Pacific. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is the first international treaty on nuclear weapons to actually recognize this disproportionate impact of nuclear weapons on Indigenous communities, and to go further and require that states parties provide assistance to victims of nuclear weapons use and testing, and to remediate contaminated land and areas by nuclear weapons use and testing. So overall, since 2017, since we've had this treaty, we've seen kind of the growing stigmatization of these weapons and recognition due to the advocacy of impacted communities of the disproportionate racist impacts of these weapons on colonialized people and Indigenous peoples.
Thank you, Alicia, for that wonderful response. What will change now that the TPNW is entering into force?
So the entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons means that all of the countries that have ratified, that have acceded to this treaty, are legally bound to implement all of the provisions in the treaty, the prohibitions, as well as the positive obligations. And these positive obligations are provisions that states parties must take actions to fully implement, including the victim assistance and environmental remediation provisions, as well as other obligations like encouraging states that have not joined the treaty yet to join, to work towards its full universalization. But we also believe that this treaty will have impacts even on countries that have not joined the treaty through the normative power of international law. And this may not happen overnight, but we've seen with other treaties that have prohibited weapons, such as the ban on landmines and the ban on cluster munitions, that these treaties have impacted the behavior of states that have not joined this treaty. Specifically, we've seen with those treaties that financial institutions divested from companies that were producing the prohibited weapon. Countries that had not joined the treaty actually changed some of their policies on use and transfer of the prohibited weapon. And companies producing the prohibited weapon in countries that had not joined the treaty actually sometimes stopped production of the weapon. So we do expect to see this treaty have a widespread impact, not only in countries that will begin to implement their obligations under the treaty, but also due to the normative impact of the treaty on states that have not joined.
Finally, Alicia, how can listeners get involved in advocating against nuclear weapons?
Well, it's absolutely critical that everyone really gets involved in work. That is the power of this campaign. The power of this treaty has been the advocacy of all of the different constituents, from religious and faith communities to the survivors of nuclear weapons use and testing, to the diplomats working on the text who really made this a reality. And so we need to really make sure the treaty has its fullest possible impact. And the way to do that is for civil society, for everybody to find their way to get involved and work on this issue. One concrete way you can do that is to go on our website, find a local ICANN chapter near you, and reach out and get involved with the work that they're doing. We have partners in over 100 countries, so there's a good chance there's for you. You can speak about this issue to your community. Why do you care about nuclear weapons? Why do you think this is an important issue? And what are you going to do about it in your local community? And you can also reach out to your local representatives, elected representatives, and urge them to join ICANN's parliamentary pledge to pledge to work to get the government on board with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and the city's appeal. We've seen cities large and small across the world adopt resolutions saying that they want their country to join foreign international law. So there are really countless different ways to get involved, and we look forward to working with you on this critical issue.
Alicia, thank you for your words of encouragement to all of us to get involved in the critical work that ICANN and its partners are doing. It is inspiring to hear that some of the most affected communities, the Hibakusha survivors from Japan and the Pacific Islanders who continue to suffer the effect of nuclear testing, continue to advocate against these weapons. But it is really a call that we all need to voice, both to seek justice for the past offenses and protect the world from future nuclear exposure. Our next speaker has particular experience advocating on behalf of the Hibakusha. Bishop Miriam Swanson is the vice moderator of the WCC Central Committee and was ordained into ministry by the Pacific Northwest Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church in 1973. While serving as a pastor, she also served as president of both the board of directors of the Rape Crisis and Domestic Violence Center, and on the board of director of North Central Washington AIDS Coalition from 1989 to 1992. She continues to pursue her goal of leading the church in becoming a more inclusive community, justice-seeking, and more perfect in love of God and neighbor. Bishop Mary, you have participated in an ecumenical pilgrimage to Japan in 2015 for the 70th anniversary of atomic bombing. Could you please tell us about the pilgrimage and some of the most moving moments which have stayed with you?
Yes, thank you so much. And Adebayo, I'm so happy to be in this conversation with you on this opportunity with the 50th ratification and the treaty entering into the force in January. It is an exciting time to participate and tell about this. Let me say first that back in the 1990s, the Satu Dane people in northern Canada learned that uranium from their region had been used in the bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And they sent a delegation of elders to Japan to apologize. I thought about them when we made our pilgrimage 5 years ago on the 70th anniversary of the bombing. It was a delegation from the World Council of Churches that were from 7 different countries that either were countries with nuclear weapons or dependent on nuclear weapons. And we were leaders in that country that wanted to speak out to clearly say that nuclear weapons must be eliminated. We want a world without nuclear weapons. The pilgrimage was such an important time for us. I had known the Sadako Suzuki story for many years. My friend Reverend Taka Ishii, a Methodist minister in New York, had written a book about the 10,000 cranes to tell her story to children around the world so that they could learn and witness for peace. I gave the book out to so many people, and at our church meetings, we would make origami cranes, and we had thousands and thousands of cranes that we had done. The crane, one crane alone, symbolizes 1,000 years of peace and happiness. So when I was on the pilgrimage and we visited the statue of Sadako in the memorial park there in Hiroshima, and I saw her holding a peace crane, I was moved to tears. Her witness was to show that a response to unspeakable violence could bring about a powerful cry for peace. And that cry for peace was born with her witness. Another moving experience for me in the pilgrimage was to meet with different hibakusha, the survivors from the bomb, and to listen to their stories. There were fewer and fewer of them living now because it's been 70 years and now 75 years. But when I met Koko Tanimoto Kondo, my life was changed forever. Her father had attended seminary in the United States, but was home in Hiroshima caring for the people in his parish at the time the bomb dropped. And she survived and he survived, but for many years she was come upon by medical people and subjected to all kinds of indignities, as were other survivors, and hate filled her heart. But then she and her family, when she was about 10 years old, were flown to America to be on a television show, a show called This Is Your Life. And her father was there and they told his story. And then they brought out someone to meet him who had actually been on the plane that dropped the bomb. She was so moved in that moment. She was moved to a deeper understanding and a new way to begin to work for peace in the world. Oh, her story was so profound. And one of the hosts for our pilgrimage was a Korean who lives there in Japan. And he was such a wonderful leader. And I learned then about the second-class treatment of the Korean people in Japan. They're not citizens, they're not allowed to vote. And this young man had been raised in Kyoto. And I learned at the time that Kyoto was to be the site of the second bomb. But due to the weather, the bombing was moved to Nagasaki. I realized that young man would never have been here And years later, I saw him when I went to a global mission event in Tanzania. It brought back to me all of the moments of memory of that experience. We continue to give thanks for life as we pray, God of life, lead us to justice and peace. Oh, I was profoundly committed more than ever after the pilgrimage to work for justice and peace. And let me say, I was moved by the witness of the Christian community in Japan. Anglican and Catholic and Protestant leaders, they're a minority in Japan, and yet they are so strong and make such a profound witness. I could go on and on, but there's not enough time. The pilgrimage was so important 5 years ago, and it's important to remember it now.
Thank you very much, Bishop Miriam. What can Christians contribute to the work of nuclear disarmament that differs from the secular sector?
I've thought a lot about what we as a Christian community can do and the ways in which we can contribute to the nuclear disarmament. Christians heed God's call to choose life and to receive the gift of God's grace. We follow Jesus, who said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God." We recognize the need to judge armaments and energy use by their effect on the people and on God's creation. In the opening books of the Bible, God's word guides us toward divine presence and purpose in creation and warns us not to interfere with creation's goodness. We're constantly reminded that all of creation is worthy of wonder and celebration and praise. In Deuteronomy, God sets before us life and death, blessings and curses. God implores us, now choose life so that we and our children may live. The danger in the world today is that the potential to worship power and the power that we have to destroy creation more than worshiping the God of creation. When we bow down to worship weapons of mass destruction and the source of their power, nuclear energy, whether it be by nuclear bang or by ecological whimper, then we are choosing death, not life. So, of course, a primary thing that we Christians can do is to keep pressure on our governments, to keep pressure about the issues, and to maintain high visibility about this concern, and to let the world know about the human impact and the cost to all creation. How much humanitarian care is lost due to the resources that are spent on nuclear proliferation. And as churches, we can work across the borders. The WCC is a global fellowship, and we're trying to address homelessness and poverty and displacement and violence and hunger and depression, that are made worse while people are spending money on nuclear proliferation. Yes, there is so much that the Christian community can do to make a difference in this issue.
Finally, while we don't expect the US to ratify the TPNW anytime soon, what role can churches in the US play to urge their government not to retreat from commitment to nuclear disarmament?
Well, again, thank you for this question. And I'm grateful that you asked it now and not a few weeks ago, because I'm much more hopeful now than I was a few weeks ago. Of course, in the United States, the National Council of Churches in the USA has been very active, and we continue to keep pressure on the government and to meet with governmental leaders, to meet with the leaders in the Defense Department. We keep trying to make a high visibility, trying to work for change in a most difficult time. And this has been a very difficult year in the United States. But we have continued in our efforts locally to partner also with the World Council of Churches as we try to pressure the government officials and to push them for commitment to the humanitarian pledge. But now I have hope as never before because of the election of a new president. With this transition, there can be commitment to nuclear disarmament. I'm hoping that will really happen, and that we will again remind our leaders that in the interest of the survival of humanity, nuclear weapons must never be used again under any circumstances. For many years, I had episcopal oversight of Hawaii, Guam, and Saipan as a part of my area here in the Western United States. And people there impressed upon me the need to tell the stories of the Marshall Islands. And this is a place where 67 nuclear bombs were exploded by our US government over 12 years. The largest one was 1,000 times stronger than the Hiroshima bomb. To this day, the Marshallese cannot return to their homes due to the contamination, and they suffer from cancer and other radiation illnesses and rising sea levels that threaten their homes and threaten to open up the nuclear waste that is buried there. So we must listen to all of the people who suffer nuclear harm, to those whose bodies are deformed by genetic mutilations and whose lands and seas are poisoned by nuclear tests, whose farms and cities are fouled by the nuclear accidents, whose work in mines and power plants exposes them to radiation. But there's a symbol of hope. A symbol of hope. You know, I talked about Sadako and her 10,000 cranes. Well, one year, her brother brought some of her cranes to Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Pearl Harbor that was bombed by the Japanese on December 7th. Yes, we are a sent people. We are ambassadors of God's unsearchable reconciliation. And we know from a kingdom of God perspective that the strategies of the present fallen order, like wealth, power, and reputation, are doomed. We live as a people aligned with those who gain no reward from the world as it is. Rather, we abide in Christ, and he is in us, and we abide in the fearlessness of love. Our God is a Lord of both well-being and calamity. We can trust the promises of God, and we can work for peace until, in fact, there is abundant life for all God's children in every place. This is my hope.
Bishop Miriam, thank you very much for your passionate sharing of your experience meeting survivors of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It is clear that these were very profound experiences for you. And we thank you that you have shared this moment with us, that you continue to lift your voice against the oppression which these weapons bring. Friends, sisters, and brothers from all over the world, it is time to conclude today's webinar. But I will be concluding by encouraging us that the journey in achieving a world free of nuclear weapons is still far ahead. And the entry into force of the TPNW, it's a beginning of perhaps what could be described as the second phase of this process. So I join you all to continue to raise the banner of our advocacy around nuclear weapons in all spaces and in all places where we find ourselves to do this. You can talk to your government, you can talk to your churches, you can talk to your parliamentarians and your policymakers who have direct influence in bringing this change on board. Finally, I particularly encourage us to continuously support the work of the World Council of Churches, the work of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, who are working tirelessly to ensure that the world is indeed free of nuclear weapons. As we wrap up this webinar, on behalf of the World Council of Churches, I extend our special thanks to all our speakers for finding time to participate in this important webinar. We thank our friends, we thank staff from WCC, from ICANN for all these efforts. Thank you very much, and God bless you all.